Look at how the size of the Air Force has changed in the past 25 years. In 1989, at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. Air Force had 4,321 fighters. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the world got safer, and the Air Force shrank, rightly so. Today, the Air Force has fewer than half the number of fighters that it had in 1989, but the world today is a lot more dangerous. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, marking the return of large-scale wars and great power conflict. China, North Korea, Iran are all backing Russia and threatening to start wars in other regions. The Air Force simply has far too few planes to meet these new challenges. And to make matters worse, most of the ones it has are old. The average Air Force fighter, not the design model, the actual aircraft, is about 30 years old. Each time you fly and land a fighter aircraft, you're applying a great deal of stress on the plane. It's a bit like bending a paperclip back and forth and back and forth. Eventually, the metal just falls apart. According to the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, these aging Air Force aircraft are increasingly neither mission capable nor safe to fly because of their advanced age and systems and structures that are failing at increased rates. Next year, the Air Force expects to retire over 130 fighters that are aging and outdated. To combat this problem, the Air Force has usually just bought new planes, like the F-35. But these purchases are not keeping up with the pace of the problem. The fleet has been getting older and smaller each year. You might think that the Air Force could just throw money at the problem, but modern fighter aircraft are way too expensive and complicated to do that. And the industrial base that makes these planes can't make very many of them in any given year. If the US Air Force had ordered a large number of F-35s right after the start of Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, those planes would be rolling out of the factory right about now. And the existing manufacturing supply chain for F-35s can only make about 150 planes per year. If the United States needed far more planes per year because, say, the Air Force was taking heavy losses in a shooting war with China, then it would likely be forced to wait far longer than 2 to 3 years, which could easily be too late. By comparison, in 1944, during World War II, the United States industrial base built 96,000 military aircraft per year. This is the crux of the problem that the Air Force is facing, and it's the culmination of a trend that has been raising alarms for nearly 50 years. In 1979, Norman Augustine, then a senior defense official, conducted a legendary analysis of U.S. fighter aircraft costs. He found that each new generation of U.S. fighter aircraft costs vastly more than the one before. And this has been true since the time of the Wright brothers. Since then, the unit cost of each new generation fighter aircraft has increased on average more than tenfold every 20 years. Augustine used that data to make a famous prediction in the 1980s, now referred to as Augustine's Law. He said, quote, "In the year 2054, the entire defense budget will purchase just one aircraft." Well, what's happened in the time since? In 2010, a much older Augustine, looking at updated data, said, quote, "We are right on target. Unfortunately, nothing has changed." The current plan for the next generation air dominance fighter anticipates that it will cost $300 million per aircraft. And this may be a conservative estimate, given that Air Force projects have an unfortunate history of blowing right through their initial cost targets. In short, the Air Force needs to buy and build more fighter aircraft fast, without breaking the budget. But how? For a decade, DoD leadership has been talking about one possible solution: AI-enabled autonomous aircraft. Without a human in the cockpit, autonomous aircraft are unburdened by the engineering and cost disadvantages of accommodating flesh and bone human pilots, who need life support, flight controls, displays, escape systems, and so on. So autonomous aircraft have at least the potential to be quite a bit cheaper. And because you're not risking the pilot's life, commanders can more comfortably put those planes in dangerous situations. And AI technology has been getting pretty good at flying planes. In 2019, DARPA ran a series of experimental trials between AI pilots and real US Air Force pilots in dogfighting simulations. The results? The winning AI system not only won, it went undefeated. More recent live flight test exercises have produced similarly promising results to these earlier virtual simulations. For a decade, the Department of Defense has invested in programs exploring low-cost, AI-enabled, and autonomous aircraft. But recently, the Air Force finally made a big bet on this concept, with a $9 billion investment in the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA program. CCAs will be autonomous in the sense that they can follow orders and take part in complex missions, including combat, without the need for step-by-step instructions. But they'll still be under the command of human pilots. Air Force leadership envisions these CCA aircraft as, quote, loyal wingmen, capable of performing a diverse set of missions, including electronic warfare, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, combat, and more. In other words, these platforms will be far more capable than traditional drones like an MQ-9 Reaper. That all sounds great, but there are still big questions about the cost of CCAs. Being autonomous doesn't by itself guarantee that the aircraft will be cheap. The CCA's predecessor programs were originally focused on a different type of military power paradigm. Instead of producing small numbers of exquisite and extremely expensive platforms, the DoD wanted a massive number of cheaper platforms that leverage AI and other autonomous technologies. The Air Force's current plans for CCA show that they are still going to be pretty expensive, and they're still going to take a while to get built. In his recent testimony before Congress, Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall estimated that CCAs would have a unit cost of about $25 to $30 million per aircraft. That's about the same cost as some of the much older version of F-16 fighters or MQ-9 Reaper drones. Still, the Air Force hasn't publicly disclosed just what these CCA aircraft are going to be capable of doing, so I'm not really in a position to say that $25 million per aircraft is a bad deal. Maybe they're getting a lot for their money. But even if it's a good deal, it's still far more expensive than the CCA precursor programs envisioned these aircraft costing. For example, the Low-Cost Attritable Aircraft Technology, or LCAT effort, was supposed to produce fighter aircraft with unit costs in the range of $3 million per aircraft, literally 10 times cheaper than what the CCA program is now going after. That would have been cheap enough that the Air Force could conceivably procure tens of thousands of them and comfortably plan to use them in conflicts where massive losses are expected, such as a war with China. Instead, Secretary Frank Kendall says that the Air Force will have, quote, over 100 CCAs on order or delivered by September 2029. In other words, the Air Force is not going to be flying large numbers of CCA aircraft on real missions before the end of this decade. And probably longer, given that most Air Force programs have a troubling history of not delivering on time. This is particularly concerning given Chinese President Xi Jinping has instructed the Chinese military to be, quote, ready by 2027 to conduct a successful invasion of Taiwan. And China is also working to rapidly introduce AI-enabled autonomous fighters into its own Air Force, with a new prototype plane unveiled at a Chinese military air show in 2024. For a decade, DoD leaders have been talking up the potential of AI. But with the CCA program, what you're finally seeing is Air Force leaders pushing all their poker chips to the center of the table and betting on the future of AI as the future of the Air Force. And with this program, they're going after the biggest problem that the Air Force fighter fleet faces, that the planes are too expensive, they're too complicated, and they take too long to make. If the CCA program works, there's going to be a big payoff to that bet. The Air Force deserves a lot of credit for doing this. They're going farther than they have in decades to meaningfully change and adapt to this new global threat landscape. But the question remains, is the Air Force going far enough? Or is it just attempting to split the difference between the new paradigm of cheap, good enough aircraft and the old paradigm of expensive, exquisite, state-of-the-art ones? I think in attempting to split the difference, the Air Force could be missing out on the true opportunity of autonomous aircraft.